Welcome back. I'm glad you could make it. In this part, we're going to discuss post-production effects in Photoshop. Basically getting the most out of the renders that come out of DAZ Studio. And if you've made it until this point in time, then a huge congratulations is in order, because we're mostly done with the DAZ Studio related part of the course, but the renders that come out of DAZ Studio, they could do with a little juicing up, and that's where post-production, your favorite 2D editor, comes in handy. Photoshop isn't the only application that you can use for that, but I recommend you look into it because it is an industry standard and it has a lot of tools that make it really easy and convenient for getting the most out of your images. In particular, we're going to have a look at the surfer images that we've made here. These are the first ones that we've created. They were lit just with the HDRI. I've made 3 versions. One is the portrait here. One is a slightly closer one, square format. That's nice for social media. And then there's another one that's a little bit closer. And those look okay, but they could do with a little bit of juicing up. So in particular, I'm going to talk about color correction here. I'm going to bring out the blues in the sky, and I might do a little bit of touching up on the eyes that they're being brightened up. And I'll also show you another tip on how to draw the viewer's attention of where it needs to go in the image. We're going to compare the befores and after so that you can make up your mind, is it worth the hassle, in quotation marks, of going through this? I say it is, because it really is the make or break between a good image and a great image. The second thing we're going to talk about is something that I'm going to discuss on this little guy. We haven't made this render together, but it's a great demo project in which I'm going to show you how to create a vignette. And once you know the principle of how to do this, it'll be a great tool in your artistic arsenal of really drawing the viewer's attention to where it needs to be, namely our character, since this is all about character rendering. And then the third tip I'm going to show you is how to replace a background. Remember this character here, the Kermie portrait? This has been rendered without the background that we saw inside DAZ Studio. I've literally just have it on a transparent background with the gray thing here that comes from my Windows image viewer. So we're going to go and replace that with something we create from scratch. And therein really lies the power. I'm also going to show you how to separate the character from that background we're going to make. And while I'm talking about this character, actually, I've rendered her out twice. And this is something that I hadn't noticed when I threw her together here, together with you. I have used the same skin texture here by Combe Jackson that I've also used on the surfer. And I thought, we have the same skin texture twice. So I thought maybe I'm going to go and render her out again. And in so doing, I can show you another little tip that we can learn from here. So the skin texture looks completely different. They're both good renders, but sometimes you or maybe your client doesn't quite know, hey, which version is going to fly best with the background if you're compositing a character onto it. So I'm going to show you a little tip of how to bring multiple images into a stack and then put a background behind them. So you can non-destructively do all these things. So you don't have to make a decision right there and then. Nothing's burned in, and it'll be all up to you in the post-production part. Let's go and open Photoshop here and bring in our first surfer image here. Let me go and either drag them in or just use the File Open menu here. On my desktop, we still have the new project folder. I really should have called that something else, but hey, it's a project folder. That's cool. Everything in here is there, one of which is the renders folder, and this is where all these images are. I'm going to go and bring in the first image here. Those are PNGs, by the way, so that means they save transparency, and they also save with a lossless compression if there is any. And that's really, really helpful. If you intend to bring any images into a 2D editor for any manipulation, I strongly recommend you do not save your renders out in JPEG format, because JPEG always saves with what we call lossy compression. So even though it reduces the file size compared to a TIFF image, for example, it does produce artifacts. And if you use a very low compression, you're okay, but it does produce artifacts. And if you don't use JPEG, if you head into post-production with these images, then you avoid all these issues that could creep up. Just to let you know, PNG is the preferred format to save it out from DAZ Studio. When you open up an image in Photoshop, it comes up as a layer. So sometimes you'll see a little lock icon here. Let me just go and double click this to close it down. This is the layer stack here on the right hand side. And sometimes you see a little lock icon here. If you import a JPEG image, that is usually the case. With PNG images, that isn't the case, and that's really helpful. Let me show you how to get around Photoshop and just introduce you to the interface in case you're not quite familiar with it. Layers are these stacks of things that you can build things up with. So for example, a text layer or a logo that you might want to add, or a border that you might want to create, that'll be on top of this layer. There could also be, if this image had transparency, there could be a background layer below this image. You can duplicate a layer just by holding down Alt and then left click and drag on the layer until this blue line appears. And if you let go, you have a duplicate of your layer. So if you do something destructively to this layer, I always recommend you make a copy of it. Hit delete to get rid of that. If you want to zoom in to an image, the easiest thing, there are tools here that you can use like the loop icon and all that. The easiest thing that I find is to hold down Alt and then just scroll the mouse wheel. That'll zoom in to the image, and scroll the mouse wheel back to scroll out. So scroll forward to zoom in, scroll back to zoom out. Once you're zoomed in, you might want to move around in the image. Like if I wanted to do something to her feet, I can go and switch either over to the hand icon here on my sidebar on the tools bar, or I can go and hold the space bar down and then that little hand comes up, and if I let go of the space bar, the hand goes away. So as long as I hold the space bar down, I can then go and left click and drag the image, and I can go and move around and have a closer look at other parts of the image. Once I'm zoomed in, I want to go back to see the full picture. I can either go and hold Alt and then go and scroll the mouse wheel, or you can press Control-0 on the keyboard and that'll zoom in the whole thing. So like the full view. Likewise, if you hit Control-1, then you go directly to 100% zoom level. So this now displays the exact pixels of your image. You can also zoom further, so you can see that here, it says 100% there. And if I say Control-0, it says 30.9%. So it's literally just fitting it in to my viewport here. Like we've discussed with the Dash Studio workspace, make this your own. As you work with Photoshop, you'll find that some things might be easier than others. In my case, I've moved the toolbar here to the right-hand side. I believe the default is that these tools are on the left-hand side. And that would mean if my layers are on the right and my image is in the middle, I constantly have to go large distances with my mouse, and that really isn't good. So it's those types of points of frustration that I seek to minimize and eliminate. So it's just a matter of left clicking and dragging these toolbars and moving them around. And that's what I've done. So if your toolbar is on the left, then that's totally fine. You can leave it there for now, but try it out and see if you think something should be in a different position, like on a separate monitor or whatever. Don't be afraid to experiment. If you do screw things up, there's a way to go and switch to a completely different workspace here under Window Workspace. These are the different workspaces here. You can reset any of these workspaces. I'm using the Essential one. You can also create yourself a new workspace and then switch between different types of workflow. So that's another way of dealing with this. Most of the tools I have displayed are in fact the defaults from the Essential workspace, and let's go get started. I'll go and zoom in a little bit with Alt and scroll the mouse wheel. And I'm going to show you the first trick that we want to apply on this image. I said, let's go and bring out the colors a little bit. And we can do that in multiple ways, much like in 3D. In 2D, there's not one way to do things. There's like 15, and you got to pick the one that works best for you. So I like the one in which I apply a correction layer on top of my image layer. So to do that, we go and head over to the bottom left here to this little icon that looks like a bit like the yin and yang icon, the black and white icon here. If I click on that, lots of options come up. And one of them is the Vibrance, and that's the one I'm going to use. There's also hue and saturation. That is something that will increase all the colors in the picture, but for skin tones, that doesn't really work very well. If you're thinking about having something like an orange skin tone and a blue sky, and you increase both in the same fashion, then you'll end up with a really nice sky, but with a really red face, and we don't want to do that. So Vibrance is the thing that Photoshop gives us that is really good for that. If I select that here, then I can see that a layer is added on top of my image here. This is that layer, and this is a correction layer. And on top of this up here, I can see that properties have opened, and those let me adjust that layer. So if I select this layer, there's some properties that I can adjust. They're kind of context sensitive. If I go and click on this one that says Vibrance, I can see that I can select two parameters here, Vibrance and Saturation. And the saturation, this is actually quite nice. I can show you the difference, what these two do, and why I advise saturation only to use in certain circumstances and vibrance really for characters. So if I go and crank up the saturation, watch what happens to the rest of the image. It increases in color. And if I do that too much, I can see that the sky now looks really nice, but the skin doesn't look all that nice. She looks almost like ill here, so that's really not good. But if I don't go above, I'll say maybe 20, 25, 30% at a maximum, this has certainly done something. So if you click on this little eyeball icon here, you can switch that layer off. And then you can see the before and after. So that's working okay for the skin tone and a little bit for the sky, but I can see that the red in the surfboard here, that doesn't look particularly good. So that's now way too red. So we're not going to go too much into that. There would be ways to select a particular color and turn that up or down, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go and set this back to 0, the saturation. I'm going to use Vibrance instead. So if you left click and drag this little slider, watch what happens now. I can really go to town to something along the lines of maybe like 60 even, and I can see that the sky really starts to pop and really starts to come out, and that looks really, really nice. I'm going to go to something really drastic like 80 here. And if I go and use that eyeball icon again to show you the before and after, this is the before and this is the after. So now I find this is rather bland, and now I get the impression with the correction layer that I'm really in the tropics somewhere. But look at what happens to her face. It isn't actually affected. I'm affecting the blues and the greens here, but I'm not affecting the reds and the yellows and the orange. So the surfboard looks pretty good, and her skin tone does as well. You can combine the two of them if you're thinking, hey, a little bit of saturation wasn't actually all that bad. I'm going to leave the vibrance at kind of 80 and add a tiny bit of saturation to it just before the surfboard starts looking really weird, maybe like 10. I can see, hey, this is looking okay. I might even get away with a little bit less of a vibrance here. And that doesn't look like a bad picture now. So this is the magic of the Vibrance layer, and I would strongly recommend you add one if you wanted to bring out sky detail and any kind of detail that you don't want it to ruin the skin tone. So Vibrance, that's one. We can do other things like this, some leeway perhaps for a little bit of contrast in here. I might want to improve that. And once again, this is completely non-destructive. When you save this now as a Photoshop document, then all these things will remain intact. I'm going to go and put this into a new folder here. I'm going to call it PSD files or Photoshop files, whatever you want to call them. I'll put that in here and I'll call that Surfer 1 Wide. And it saves it with the PSD extension. That's Photoshop's native format. So when you save that, you have all the control over any of the bits and pieces that we're adjusting here. So maybe you've gone over the top with the Vibrance, or maybe your client says, hey, this isn't what I had in mind, and we need to make some other adjustments and stuff. You can do that. So, you know, the more layers you add, the more adjustments you can make after the fact that the picture has been rendered. So let's do the same now with maybe a little bit of contrast and brightness, just to show you where they are. So once again, at the bottom here, we click on this little yin-yang icon here, and we're going to go and use brightness contrast. There's a couple of others here. There's curves, there's levels, there's exposure. You can play with all of these. I'm just going to show you the brightness and contrast, just, you know, so that we get into the mood of how Photoshop thinks about these things. Another layer is created, and this one's now above the Vibrance layer. So you can swap these around. If you want to make a contrast adjustment before color gets adjusted, you just left click and drag on the layer and move it until this blue line pops up, and then you let go, and then the order of these two things has been swapped around. Kind of depends. I think I'm going to make the brightness contrast adjustments before. But also watch what happens if I were to grab my image layer and put that at the top of the stack. Watch what happens to the image now. If I put that at the very top, the color correction is gone. And that's because Photoshop looks at the bottom layer first and then applies any layer on top of that onto the bottom layer. So bottom layer is the first one in the stack. So in our case, the image. Or if we had a background like we're going to see in a minute, it'll be the background. So once again, I'm going to select the brightness contrast layer here. I'm going to zoom in and just have a quick look what that is going to do to our image. I'm going to increase the contrast here left click and drag to increase the contrast and make that harder, or left click and drag all the way into the minus section, and then that makes the image a little bit softer and the contrasts are being, washed out. See what I'm doing here? See what look and feel you like for your image. So I find maybe a little bit of additional contrast would be nice, but so that does the overall of the image a favor, but it might not work on her face. So we're going to have a look at that a little bit later. As I do that, the colors might also change. So you can go back to the Vibrance layer and now go and adjust that if you like. And this is how you go around until you come up with the perfect picture. I'm going to leave it here for now and just go and hit Control S to save this and open the next image and make the same adjustments on that. So File, Open. I'll go back to my renders folder. I'm going to go and select this one here, Surfer 2 Close. There we go, new image. If you had something that you've already made and you think, hey, I basically need the same adjustments, maybe there wasn't just 2 layers, maybe it was 12 layers, and I want to have the same adjustments in this image so that I have a consistent color quality here, you can go and copy adjustment layers from one image into another, and that's what I might do here. I'll go back to the first image. Rather than setting all these things up from scratch, I might go and put these in a group. So I'll go and shift select both layers, and then I'll go and left click and drag them all the way down onto this little folder icon here, which puts these 2 layers into a group. I know it's a lot to take in, but it's one of those things that really grows on you. It tidies things up. Look at that. We have a group. We can double click it to name it, and I'm going to call that color correction, just so that I know what that is. I'm doing that to tidy up the layer stack, but most importantly, I can now go and right click on this group and choose to duplicate my group. And when I do that, I can either stay in the same document and just make a copy of that, or under document, I can go and pick a different document that is now open, like in my case, the Surfer 2 Close, like this one here. I can also create a brand new document with that. So I'll do that, hit OK, and then I'll go back to my second image here, and I can see that my color correction group has been applied, and that's kind of cool. So now I have both these effects in both images, and that is really, really neat. So those are handy shortcuts that I think really means Photoshop does us a huge favor when it comes to dealing with a variety of images. Not only is it efficient, it saves us time, and also it saves us render time. We don't have to do all this inside DAZ Studio and wait for the next render to come out. So this is nice. I can go ahead and do the same thing to the third image, or I can go and import my third image as another image layer into this document. Let me show you how that works. I'm going to select this image layer here, and then I'm going to go and bring my next document directly into this Photoshop document. So I'm not going to say File, Open, because that would just create a new Photoshop document. I'm going to have a variation of this render inside this Photoshop document, and that works by choosing File, whoops, Place Embedded here. There's actually 2. There's Place Embedded and Place Linked. Linked means it'll bring in an image and look at that file on the hard drive, and if that ever changes, those changes are also being imported into this Photoshop document. Whereas Place Embedded will import it and essentially clone the data. So if you remove the image on the hard drive, it'll still be inside your Photoshop document. It will be saved as part of the PSD file. So I'm going to do that. Place Embedded. Then I'm going to go and pick one, namely this one here, Surfer 3 Closer. So we have one that's close, and this one is closer. I'll say Place. And since they both are the same size, I can go and just hit Enter. See these lines here? That's basically Photoshop waiting for me to maybe make a change, like move it around, make it bigger, smaller, whatever. I'm just going to press Enter, and then those changes are locked in. And now I'm going to have these 2 images, and I have one color correction stack on the top. So now if I go and select this eyeball icon here, this is my first image. I can go and name that something. I'll say Surfer Close, and then this one here is Surfer Closer. So double click to rename if you want to do that. And now we can choose which one we want to use. You can also go and zoom into an image. That is also possible. That's why these handles are there. Whichever layer that's currently active and visible is selected. With this little move tool selected, the shortcut key for that is V, you can go and grab any of these handles and make that a little bit bigger. So this means now if I left click and drag this out, this means that my image is going to be resized and it will be cropped at the canvas size. So say I had rendered something, I'm thinking, there's a palm tree looking in here and I want to have that a little bit closer. I can just go left click and drag any of these handles here. Control Z will undo that. It'll retain its aspect ratio, so you can do that from any point. You can also do that from the middle by holding the Alt key. So left click and drag while holding Alt will now scale the image from the center. That's also nice to know. So if you wanted to do that, have a little, whatever, zoom in retrospectively, you can do that. Left click and drag on the layer to move it. That'll work. If you ever want to scale disproportionately, I'm just going to go Control Z out of this, or hit Escape to undo this whole operation. Then we'll be back to where we were a minute ago. If you ever wanted to do this non-proportionally, you could hold down the Shift key. So if I do this here, left click and drag on this, you can see that the image aspect ratio doesn't change. Just in case you ever need to do that, hold down Shift while you do that, and then you can squish it and squash it in whatever direction you want. So that's another trick that we can use in Photoshop here. Just in case you've rendered too much or too little, you can do all kinds of things. Escape will get you out of that. That's kind of the move tool here. Let's go and save this as well as a PSD file so I can include it in the product. I'm going to go put this into my PSD files and I'll call it Surfer 2 close. Hit save. We're going to leave these documents open. We're going to come back to this in our next part, in which I'm going to show you a little trick of the vignettes. Stay tuned for that.